Hello and welcome. This is Ben Adamson. I'm lead technical consultant for Mimecast Australia, and you've got Michael Tempone as well from the Brennan IT side. Today we'll be taking you through for the next 45 minutes some detail around advanced email attacks, talking about the ecology and the landscape that we're seeing there with the threats, and then also talking about the kinds of solutions that you can put in place to mitigate that risk. Now, as always, this sort of forms part of a broader approach or a layered approach, and our partners such as Brennan IT really provide that holistic kind of story around that. So if you have any questions throughout, please do feel free to enter those into the questions tab, and we'll address those either as we go, at the end, or we'll take them offline. And if you have any kind of technical issues with the webinar, please just contact Zahida. You've got the number there. And you can also pop a question in the chat if that's a preference as well. So what we've seen in recent years is a real shift in the email threat sort of discussion. We've moved away from a scenario where what we were looking at was mainly a traditional sort of antivirus, anti-spam scenario. So really what solutions had to be able to do was look at emails and compare them with previous examples, and be able to recognise if we had something that was, potentially not desirable. But the outcomes would usually be around either a malicious payload that was attached to the email, or potentially something that was of nuisance value. So we've really now moved into a space where we have threats which are much more real in terms of their outcomes when we talk about things like crypto locker, and we talk about things like fraud, where people are transferring large amounts of money. And very much a focused approach. So people sending in emails which are designed to make it through a lot of those traditional security checks, but also to have the recipient action the email. So really to quite quickly look at it, recognize it as something that they would generally receive, and go ahead and click or open the attachment. And you can sort of see there that 1 minute and 22 seconds is pretty typical. We absolutely see that, when examples make it through to customers and prospects, that they are having the issue of the email actually being actioned. Now, what that might sort of look like is a relatively contained problem in terms of having to maybe mitigate some crypto locker, etc., restore some machines. But what it really leads to is a broader problem of it being a relatively easy entry point into an organisation, and also that idea that being the easiest point, it's become the most frequently used. So that 95% of the sort of breach incidents are starting with that phishing mechanism. And it's something that is gaining mindshare. So talking about that idea that these breaches are newsworthy, if we do have a large profile incidence of information becoming public, or cash being transferred, or whatever it might be, where that does become public, people are interested. It's very newsworthy. So organisations now tend to need to also work against that risk and make sure that they're doing what they can to protect their reputation. And I think even on that sort of basis, the idea that individuals are aware of their own information, and it's becoming really easy for them to be able to see who has lost some of their data. When their information is involved in a breach, they can check on websites such as this one, which is the Have I Been Pwned one, where it sort of just says, look, based on the information that we've garnered, you've been involved in these particular breaches. And you can see there that's referring to the Adobe one. Most people will find that the recent LinkedIn one has been a bit of an issue, and that they'll have had their information revealed multiple times. So again, as organisations that handle data, and that's pretty much organisations of all types and sizes, we've got things like employee data, the data of our trusted partners and business associates, and then also our customers. We have to be able to treat that with that very high level of due diligence and make sure that it's not being released. And I think a big shift has been as well the idea that you don't have to be a massive organisation in terms of what you do have, because the price can vary. When we see people release maybe a smaller list onto the black market, it'll start out at a price of a fraction of a Bitcoin, and then as it becomes more widely circulated, that price will drop, and then generally, ultimately, that information will be made freely available. And part of this as well is that idea that what the hacker or the perpetrator is actually looking for is to own the organization or to take something from them. So that idea that part of the outcome or what they're looking for is not necessarily a great deal of monetary gain, but within their community, it's more just to be able to say, look, you know, we tried to get into this organization, we were able to, that's kind of cool. And I think that's sort of, you know, a little bit of a shift as well in terms of people thinking that they might be protected by virtue of the fact that they're a smaller organization or that they have a low profile. It tends now to be, you know, the idea that if you've got a domain name that's public, people are able to understand what your security looks like in a lot of cases from outside, from an email point of view. So it sort of becomes more a process of just sort of working through those different organizations. And unfortunately, it is a sort of a neglected area. So it becomes, you know, quite easy for people who have sort of just renewed their traditional antivirus, anti-spam year on year to have this sort of gap in their defenses. And that's where we sort of, I guess, introduce talking with our partners such as Brennan, where we've got that idea that there is a broad spectrum of things that you'll be dealing with from an organizational standpoint, but just understanding that obviously over time that landscape does change and it opens up a requirement for new products in some cases. And this is one of those scenarios where, you know, you sort of had that probably quite effective solution in terms of keeping out the nuisance spam from the inbox, etc. But then over time, we've seen that become less effective with these much more targeted type threats. And it has now opened up what is for perpetrators of attacks quite a sort of obvious and easy entry point. It's not going to have the same difficulty from their point of view that would be associated with trying to breach a perimeter, for instance. It's really going to be more in a lot of cases around being able to structure a socially engineered attack, but really being able to now sort of understand that it is a departure from the traditional, it's a new product set and it looks after this new, now fairly open sort of gap in the defenses. So when things do make it through and we have things land in the inbox, that's where we sort of start to open up a bit of an issue. So 95% of breaches are starting with a phish, and we've also got that idea that, you know, we've got sort of the phishing click the link stat there. If people receive attachments, even if they're not expecting them, even if they don't know the sender, the human behavior is to sort of open it up and take a look. And in a lot of the examples we see, you know, the subject line or the name of the attachment or the content body, it will be designed to make it seem very intriguing. So you'll often see things around, you know, a list of maybe people's incomes within the company. You might have things which are associated with a particular utility provider or a bill or something where you think it's maybe just been sent to the wrong person. All of that design that goes in really means that we, you know, have the click mentality. And then even additionally, where we have a requirement to enable macros for something to go wrong, even when they've opened the email, they've opened the attachment says, yeah, you'll need to enable macros to be able to see these contents. And sometimes it'll be quite clever in terms of saying, this is an encrypted document, to unencrypt it, you need to go ahead and click enable. There's a, you know, relatively high proportion that will go ahead and actually do that. So this is where we sort of talk about that big change in requirement. You're not going to necessarily stop all of these examples at the gateway. You need to ensure that once you're down at that level where an end user is making a decision, that you're able to effectively intervene and provide some solution there as well. The other thing is that unfortunately a lot of these sort of malicious payloads are fairly endpoint averse. So absolutely you need to make sure you've got the best product available for endpoint protection, but also recognizing that you might not have a 100% success rate in terms of endpoint protection protecting you from that threat should it make it down to the PC. And again, it's all just sort of leading up to that time where someone will be pwned or sort of lead speak for that idea that, you know, someone's been able to conquer that, gain ownership, get something deployed onto an end machine. And once that's happened and it's reporting back up to the command and control center, you're potentially in a scenario where, you know, banking logon details are being sent, personal information, people might gain control over that machine and be able to effectively control it remotely or extract information on demand. That's the scenario that we're absolutely trying to avoid. One of the scariest parts, and this is something that we sort of see again and again, is also this idea that the threats can be quite latent. And I think in a way, CryptoLocker has given people a false sense of security in that it is absolutely a very visible threat. So when we talk about things like CryptoLocker, CryptoWall, Locky, where the machine is completely locked up and you essentially have to either pay a ransom or rebuild the machine, you know, obviously that's something that you're going to know about. So, and as an administrator, you're going to be involved in that remediation. You can count how many of those you have in a 6-month period, but there's a lot of other threat types that are deployed by these same mechanisms. So we talk about the most common ones generally being your sort of Trojans, like your Dridex Trojans, etc., your keyloggers, your insertions into browsers, but also the idea that, you know, someone might just be taken off to a dummy website and enter some credentials. The issue with those kind of threats, and at the moment the statistics tell us that it's a relatively high, and we'll look at this down the line a little bit, a relatively high percentage, they can remain undetected for a long period of time. And in a lot of cases, it may not be until the breach becomes apparent that you'll sort of look back and reverse engineer and work out where that breach might have come from. So again, the key is in a lot of cases being able to intervene and stop them from taking hold in the first place. But also in terms of providing those interventions, it starts to give you a clearer picture on what's been happening in the organisation, where you've been able to stop a breach occurring. And this is an interesting part of when we start to roll out some of those protection methods. Customers will often be really surprised at how quickly those numbers will rise. And the numbers will be associated with, if this mitigation had not been in place, what kind of threat would I have seen roll through to this endpoint? Maybe it would have been a CryptoLocker, but equally it might have been some kind of Trojan or other malware that, you know, generally, as I say, quite endpoint averse, and just sitting there sort of invisible to the, or with no transparency to the admin. So I think that's another really key thing to point out, is just being able to get that really clear view on what would have come through, but then also extending that to which users within the organisation would have introduced the threat, which is key, because it means that we can increase the level of education to those users. And there's stuff baked into the Mimecast offering which allows us to deliver that education, which is really powerful as well, meaning that we've got a better decision-making process taking place when those emails are seen by an end user. So just coming back around, and I sort of touched on this earlier, to that idea that we have a lot of sort of trust built up from other organisations, from other stakeholders. So in terms of our employees, our business partners, our customers, we may not be the target. It may be one of those groups that are actually the target. And we've seen that with various attacks where a smaller organisation, perhaps servicing a larger organisation, will be used as a stepping stone. So being that sort of pivot which allows them to enter a large organisation. And I think famously we sort of saw this with the global attacks on Target, where it was sort of an air conditioning contractor that allowed that stepping stone to come in. So I think when we think about the broader implications of it having a threat come through, it's really key to understand that it doesn't sort of start and finish with what's on our own servers. It doesn't start and finish with what's on our own systems. It could potentially be that by logging onto a third-party extranet, for instance, when we have a keylogger installed, that we've accidentally or inadvertently given access to another stakeholder who may be, you know, one of our most important customers, who may be a multinational, you know, whatever it might be. So when we're thinking about the extent of prevention, it becomes really key, because some of the discussions we have, and I'm sure that the partners have as well, is around, oh, I haven't sort of seen this kind of threat yet. But I think these are the kind of threats where you have to be out in front of them, or you may not be aware, you know, how many you've sort of had within your organisation. It's key to sort of be very proactive, because the damage to reputation can be fairly profound. So when we talk about, I guess, the types of threats, phishing is the sort of blanket term that we use, and we're sort of drilling now into sort of what the threats look like and what some of the mitigations are. But it can take a number of different forms. So the idea being, though, that something's being sort of dangled there, essentially in front of a person to get them to do something, and that can be, to click on a URL, to open an attachment which has a secondary action, to transfer some funds, to send out a summary of detailed information. All of these things are sort of falling under that phishing umbrella. And as opposed to previous solutions, a lot of these types of attacks require a particular response or a custom solution, which goes beyond, adding a filter or updating a signature. It really needs a detailed dev response to be able to be effective. And they're generally also, very well researched. So when we talk about, someone receiving an email and making a decision about whether they would like to open it or action it or not, it's going to be informed in a lot of cases by research from the person. It's often a one-to-one type attack as well. So you'll actually have somebody undertaking an email discussion with you. And we've seen, various incarnations of that informed by social media networks such as LinkedIn and Facebook, and these can be really useful in terms of first framing the discussion. So who would this person generally be talking to? What's the structure of their organization? But also their availability. So is this person going to be in a position to intervene in this action that I'm taking? So say they're going to be on an international flight for the next 16 hours. That's probably a really good time for me to impersonate them. Those kind of things are now sort of out in the public sphere. If people are using, Twitter and, Tripit or, all these kind of things that all sort of mesh together to give us a good window on where people are at, it raises the effectiveness of these attacks. And it also provides windows for pressure to be applied. And that's definitely a big part of that sort of social engineering. So we'll see scenarios where, by way of impersonating a senior stakeholder or an important customer, pressure can be applied which will bypass procedure. And I think that's key, because I've also seen, customers saying we have a lot of procedures in place to make sure that nobody will transfer funds without going through a number of steps, and we hear things like code words being used, etc., etc. But the fact is that if you end up in one of these scenarios where someone first applies pressure and then increases that pressure over the course of a number of hours, clearly someone's going to start to potentially make an assessment of whether they're going to lose their job, whether they're going to lose a customer, and that tends to change the rules quite a lot. So there'll be a different decision-making process around, do I make this transfer and worry about the consequences later? And that's obviously a massive problem and really sort of results in a lot of these attacks becoming more effective. And it really is just sort of this social engineering story, which has been around forever. It's sort of, the con job or, a way to get somebody to do something that they wouldn't naturally do. And it's really around that idea of building trust and gaining the mind share of a person to get them to act essentially as you would like them to. And that's what we sort of call whaling, is that impersonation aspect, where we're going after a particular organisation stakeholder, generally someone quite senior, and I guess that's why we call it whaling, because it's sort of like the big fish. You're really sort of aiming to have a big payoff, something that you can haul in, and it'll be, something that's fairly significant. And we'll hear it named, in various ways. Business email compromise is a big term going around at the moment, and that's sort of what the FBI will call it. CEO fraud is what we're sort of seeing it called more locally here, I would say. And W-2 fraud is an interesting terminology that's come out of the US around the sort of tax time filings, and it has sort of been taken up a bit more globally, just to refer more to the release of information, which might be personal or corporate information, but it differentiates itself, I guess, from being a transfer of funds to instead being the release of, say, a summary of the earnings of the people within the company for the last 12 months. It might be, something to do with a customer list. These are the kinds of things where, if someone believes that it's, for instance, the head of accounts, they would just send that across. So being able to effectively impersonate in that space means that it's not necessarily a funds transfer you're aiming for, but again, just trying to get that information, potentially put it on the black market or use it for other purposes. And all of these different methods that we talk about really rely on people's idea of truth at a point in time. So if they can look at an email and decide that they think it's legitimate and that what's being asked is true, what's being presented is a truth, they're very likely to proceed with the action. And a lot of work goes into, I guess, creating this scenario or creating this environment where you could have a person, act in that particular way. So to start to put that in context, we really have an increasing issue. Now, in Australia, we don't have that sort of central reporting body where we have the public knowledge as much. We don't have mandatory reporting. So a lot of the discussions that we have or a lot of the feedback that we get is more anecdotal. But in the States, they do sort of have this, quite good central reporting mechanism. They do have the mandatory reporting. And importantly, in Australia, we have now had the sort of call for comments on our legislation around mandatory reporting. So it's something that we would expect to see in the next sort of 12, 24 months potentially. And I guess that again raises that issue of, getting out in front of the threat, being able to, hedge that risk around reputation. But we can see there it's big numbers that we're talking about. So, globally, we're talking sort of, that January to May 2016, the number of victims is obviously massive. The amount of dollars that have changed hands as a result are very, very large, talking sort of above 3 billion. And that increase over a relatively short period of time in the volume of the threat, so talking over 1,000% increase. So it's not something that's sort of going away. And I think key in terms of how we deal with the issue is also the idea that it is very dynamic. So this is quite a lot of detail in a single shot, but I think the key things to sort of call out here are the idea that we've had this very large increase even in one quarter. So you can sort of see there from Q4 2015 to Q1 2016, we had that 789% increase. We've had all these waves of phishing. But in that, we're not just sort of seeing the same old suspects or the same old threats coming through time after time. What we're seeing is a very dynamic environment where groups are working together to produce tools which are more effective over time. And you can see there, like in February, we had the Locky threat come out. It's the first time that it sort of appeared in any significant numbers. But then by March, it's absolutely the predominant threat. So if people don't have defences in place, it can really sort of sweep through and be quite catastrophic. The other thing I'd point out is that in terms of the sort of malware family, we've seen a big swing away from the URL click-through type threats and towards the Office macro type attachment. And that's where we see people clicking on those attachments, enabling macros, and again having these various payloads delivered. And calling for more of a sandboxing type technology in most cases. And the reason that we see this swing is that it's the most effective vector at the given time because these defences aren't in place. So as people have moved to put in URL type defences, this is still seen as something that's potentially an open area. And I guess the detail that the sandboxes are able to perform, the intelligence, all of that plays a part as well, so the quality of the solution. And calling out as well, I referred to this before, the idea that you've only got 50% of the phishing attacks resulting in ransomware. And that's really key, again, that other 50%, being able to mitigate against those risks because potentially there are things that you're not seeing. So talking to sort of what we do about this, I'll step you through what our technology offering looks like in terms of providing mitigation. But absolutely key and part of your discussion with Brennan is more around what does that broader picture look like. from end to end for our organization, how are we managing all different kinds of risks at all different points in their life cycle? And that will speak to, things like the perimeter, the endpoint, et cetera, and Michael's going to take you through, exactly what that landscape and offering looks like. But essentially, we play a really important part in, addressing these risks and doing it away from your infrastructure. But it will form part always of a broader spectrum approach and a layered approach. So for inbound email, and this is where we'll sort of start our story, I guess, in terms of focusing down on the things which are inbound and the things which don't necessarily fit into that sort of traditional antivirus, anti-spam, and they're the things we designate as sort of targeted threats. But we've got a very broad stack in terms of the security, and we've also got that sort of global security team, which means that 24 hours a day, we've got people focusing on what are the phishing threats that we're seeing come through, what do we need to have in place to protect our customer base, and it means that administrators of individual organizations aren't having to recognize threats, create custom filters, et cetera. They're not having to spend a lot of time in queues, sort of working out what to release and what not to release. And that just comes as part of our sort of, very multifaceted, broad spectrum approach that we take in making sure that we're leveraging both the best in our own technology and the best in our third-party intelligence sources as well to reach that really clear consensus on is an item desirable or not, or if it was so well engineered that it actually made it through to the inbox, how can we intervene to make sure that the payload isn't ultimately delivered? So for those items that do make it through to the inbox, we focus on the three core areas of the click-through, the attachment open, and the impersonation, and we do that with these three elements. So in terms of the product line, as I say, it's not just simply sort of another filter or another signature update. It's a very bespoke behavioral part of our product which steps through and makes sure that we're getting the best possible outcome for these particular attack types. So looking at the URL mechanism, first of all, we rewrite the URLs as they pass through our gateway. So if we have an email link within an email, you click on that email link. If it's a legitimate browsing attempt and there's nothing malicious, we'll make that assessment and we'll let the end user go through. Very low latency. What we do at that time of click is really key. So we take a broad spectrum approach. We'll look at a number of intelligence sources. We know things, I guess, that a traditional web filtering solution would not know, and that's what provides that unique differentiation. So yes, you'd still have a web filtering solution in place. You wouldn't displace that. This is specifically focused around those links that come from within emails. So we've got all that detail on what's happened now with that sender's reputation from an email point of view. We might have gone ahead and performed IP outbreak control on those sending IPs because we've seen across our customer base that something isn't right. We've also got a good level of intelligence from things like the blacklists and the reputation services, etc. So we've got that email intelligence that we can bring to bear. And then also in terms of the real-time scanning behavior or behavioral check, in bringing that return or that request back into a safe environment to understand what's it trying to do. Is it doing a dozen redirects, or is it trying to bring down an install or an executable? What's that sort of end outcome? And then looking at the broader context of the website or the web space that that's coming from. Have other attacks come from here? What's going to happen potentially if that person goes to that web space and starts to browse around? Is there something worrying that we would need to know about? And then the third pillar, I guess, is that more traditional approach for web filtering. So categorization, is it categorized criminal, those kind of things. But what we get is a very high accuracy, very low false positive approach, which means that admins aren't having to constantly sit in our console and create whitelistings, etc. But it means that when we see threats come through, like the Australian Federal Police, like the utility type bills where there's a click-through, if it's blocked, we'll provide a little bit of education, about why potentially that's been blocked. But importantly, it's not a continue anyway kind of interface. It's not going to provide that end user with the ability to make a decision to go ahead and potentially introduce the risk. That's very much for the admin to decide. Now, I mentioned before that we can also introduce some education or some user awareness to the approach as well. And we do that by allowing the administrator to decide, on that campaign, how many clicks or what percentage of clicks would you like to see for a particular group within the business. So it's very granular, very easy to control via Active Directory groups, etc. But you might say that for the general population, you would want them to see a prompt 5% of the time, so 1 in 20 clicks. And we want them to be able to see, where has this email come from? Where is it trying to go? And based on the sort of questions, would you still consider this to be a good browsing interaction? So do you know this person? Were you expecting the email? Does it look sort of, like it's in good standing? If they accept the risk and continue, if it's a bad browsing attempt, we're still going to go ahead and block it. If it's cool, they'll get a little congratulations. But it's really important that on the back end, within the dashboarding, etc., what we're building up is a clear picture of who within the organisation would be making these poor click-through attempts, what that might sort of amount to in terms of the threat outcome, and then also additionally, who are the people who, even when they're shown these prompts, progress to make the click-through. So are they not thinking about it? Are they simply not aware of the risk and unable to make a clear assessment? It puts you in a good position to be able to further that education. Now, an emerging, I guess not emerging, but now a predominant kind of threat vector, and the one we saw in that graph before, is around the attachments which have been made malicious by way of macros. So it's not a traditional sort of virus in terms of the attachment isn't a virus. The attachment is a mechanism to deliver down something malicious as a second sort of stage. So we differentiate that from traditional virus and malware, for which we have a 100% SLA in terms of our protection against those known threats. What we're talking about here is a potentially very complex macro within a document, and a macro which is designed to be evasive of sandboxing. So generally a sandbox is going to take an approach of trying to throw all the various parameters at a file to try and get that macro to act and understand what all the various lines of the macro do and whether any of them might have a malicious outcome. So essentially for us, in terms of sandbox technology, we take a best-of-breed sandbox, we deploy it on our grid compute, gives us the best possible processing speeds and the very high rate of accuracy, very low rate of false positives that we want. And we can just sandbox everything as it arrives with a very short delay, because that can often be a negative impact of sandboxing is just the time that it takes. For us, we're looking at a time typically of sort of 3 minutes to run it through all those different parameters. But what we can do, which we're finding to be even more powerful, is a unique approach where we transcribe the document to a safe PDF. So that means that that document which is delivered is actually known to be 100% safe. And you can see in this example, we've got the PDF which we can open. There's no way that that can deliver any kind of malicious outcome. And it's only then when a person's looked at that attachment that they decide to release it into the sandbox. And they do that by going into the instruction attachment and doing a single click release. But essentially what that's going to provide is two really important things. One is the human assessment, so someone looking at it and deciding, is this a legitimate document that I think I want to look at? But also the time delay that that creates is very powerful because the sandbox is always becoming more intelligent, is constantly updated. So even if we introduce a couple of extra minutes, that might be the difference between a threat being detected and intervened or being able to be a sandbox escape. And when we talk about a sandbox escape, we're talking about generally a brand new variant of a threat in its first minutes of existing. So if that filters through to an endpoint, goes into the sandbox isn't able to correctly identify that threat and passes out to the endpoint. So this method introduces that delay and that extra bit of rigor, if you like, in terms of whether it should be released or not. And we're seeing this now being adopted by the majority of our customers as the default. And then again, very granular, very easy to control for an admin in terms of saying, no, for this group, I'd rather use a preemptive sandbox, put everything through the sandbox when it arrives. Or for this group, they're sort of receiving from a trusted domain. We're not going to sandbox that. We know it raises our risk profile, but we're still going to do that. All of those options are possible. If something's blocked, the end user will receive a notification. And then the admin receives a good level of detail too on what was actually the reason for the blocking, it's going to be very clear that it was trying to do things which were not something that a legitimate macro would ever do. And this can be useful just in terms of having that conversation around, you know, if someone asks for their attachment, they think that it's legitimate, you can be quite clear about why they can't have that released. The end user experience is really straightforward. As I said, if they open that instruction attachment, it's a single click on the request files that will release it into the sandbox, and that initiates that process of testing, as I mentioned, and that generally for us, as I say, sort of 3 minutes is typical, 5 minutes is average global at the moment. So, I mean, for most people, I think that's sort of the level of protection which is sort of absolutely baseline. It needs to be there. It's a requirement at this point in time to defend against those sort of very, very common now attack types. And the third area that we concentrate on is one which has been really difficult for people to effectively get away from, so the impersonation type fraud. To strike a balance using a technology rather than having a person make an assessment. And the kinds of emails we're talking about are the ones which have the, you know, from a trusted stakeholder, purportedly because of their display name, coming through to a person they would typically email in the style that they would typically email them. So you can sort of see here, this is an example that came in, and we've used our product, so you can see that it's tagged up with suspicious, etc. But that came in, you know, to the correct person, it's using the correct language, it's asking them to release all of those personal details in the form of a PDF, and to send them back to this person. Now, we can see if we're very clever that the email address has a domain which is similar but not the same, so we can see it's MLM. But other than that, if the person didn't cotton onto that, say they're on their mobile phone, etc., they're potentially going to reply to that with the payload that the person wanted. So what we've done is we've recognized a number of common factors which we can use in combination to really effectively highlight these messages. So we'll look at things like, you know, we know who all the people are within the organization because we're sending all the email out. We've got the AD synchronization. If we see that display name coming in, that's something that we would probably consider to be, you know, pretty suspicious. So we've got that aspect of it. Also the similarity of the domain and the domain's activity. Was it recently registered? Has it suddenly become active? You know, they're things that are kind of key. And also the message content. Does it have, you know, overdue invoice, you know, funds transfer, all those things which around this particular threat might be, you know, particularly useful. Now we can do a block, we can do a traditional hold. The hold can be end user, admin or moderator. But generally what people are doing is using the tagging. So you can see there that sort of insertion of the tagging. We can also tag the headers with a bit of you know, technical detail on why it was blocked. And we can also send a notification out to a predefined group, which is really, you know, key in terms of maybe getting a second set of eyes on that email before it gets action. Now, just to sort of cover off a couple of things about the Mimecast solution, in terms of the data residency and jurisdiction, for Australian customers, we leverage our Australian data centres. So we have 2 data centres here in Australia to give us our highly available configuration. And there's no sort of failover scenario where that data would leave that jurisdiction. We've been very focused on the security aspects of the product today, but I do just want to highlight that there is a broader scope there, and Brennan are across all of these different offerings and able to talk about them. And also the fact that we are very much optimized from an Office 365 point of view. So regardless of what your email infrastructure looks like, we can often provide that value in terms of being able to give you unified management, a single layer of admin, and being able to, you know, do away with some of those legacy solutions. And we hold ourselves to the highest standards in terms of the security of our platform and our organization, and also how we handle that personally identifiable information. Now, thanks for your attention. That's sort of what I wanted to cover off with you today. I'm going to hand you over to Michael, who's going to go through sort of the broader security landscape and also how Brennan can sort of help in giving you that more holistic view.
Thanks, Ben. So I'll be covering off the 2016 security landscape, how we've seen it to date in the IT industry at the moment. So 2016 has been quite an interesting year in security. Insights from the Global State of Information Security Survey shows that in the last 12 months, the total number of detected incidents globally have increased over 38%. Australia, in particular, has seen this number of detected incidents increase by a staggering 109%. As these threats continue to mount, understanding and managing cybersecurity risks have become front of mind for many Australian businesses. And as a result, these businesses are also embracing a more collaborative approach to cybersecurity, one in which intelligence on threats and response techniques are shared with external partners. This change of thinking has resulted in an increase of the global IT budget allocation for IT security by 24% over the previous year. However, more interestingly is that Australian businesses are taking the lead, allocating more funds to secure their networks and data due to the dramatic increase. Over the last 12 months, data breaches have been reported affecting the customers of retailers such as Kmart and David Jones, educational institutions such as Queensland TAFE, and one of the biggest security breaches in the last 12 months to the matchmaking site Ashley Madison. This breach had over 37 million unique customer details published. This is just some of the thousands of breaches which occur annually, and one thing will immediately strike you on this. No location, industry or organisation is immune from attack. Even with the strongest defences, you can't bank on not being breached, but you can deter the criminals. So essentially, there's no such thing as an impenetrable system, but often the modest defence will deter cyber criminals. They'll move on and look for an easier target. Unfortunately, many organisations fail to achieve this modest approach. So long gone are the days of simply having a firewall to protect your business. As we've discovered today, there are many types of threats to IT that businesses face, which require a layered security approach to be adopted to minimise your potential exposure. As you can see, there are 6 layers that make up this approach. Physical security essentially deals with ensuring only authorised personnel have the physical access to your infrastructure, whether it be infrastructure in a data centre or on-premises infrastructure. Perimeter security, devices such as firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention devices as well, mail filtering and services such as Mimecast as we discussed today, and web filtering play a pivotal part in your network protection, ensuring that all the cyber criminals stay out of your network. Network security focuses on the internal running of your network. Essentially, segmentation and network authentication are key parts to this approach, as well as setting up demilitarised zones, commonly known as DMZs as well. Host security is also another important part, and this focuses on your servers and end-user computing as well as mobile devices as well, making sure that any potential attack vectors are minimised on those devices as well. Application and data security is another important layer where that focuses primarily on ensuring that only the authorised staff have access to those documents, and obviously that staff can access documents that they've been allocated to. So ensuring the right people can see the right documentation and data. And user awareness, and that's another key part that generally, no matter how secure you have your network, people still play an important part in IT security, and having your staff aware of the security threats in the landscape is a key part to ensuring that they make sure that they have security in the front of their minds. So how does Brennan IT approach security? Quite simply, we integrate security into the core of our products and services which we offer to our clients. As you can see, we have a number of solutions that cover across those 6 layers. As I touched on before, the physical aspects, we have the ability to co-locate your infrastructure, and that's all managed and securely monitored by a network operations center. If you have a smaller environment that currently exists on site, we can provide secure on-premises racks to ensure that only authorised access is available to that physical hardware. Our perimeter protection offerings cover distributed denial of service attacks, as well as intrusion detection and prevention services via our managed virtual firewall platform. Services such as Mimecast and our other security vendors that we work with provide some cloud-based services as well to ensure that your perimeter is also secured. Our networking standpoint from a secure VRF and our network design services ensure that your network is configured in a way that ensures that security is paramount. Remote access as well is another key aspect, so we offer SSL VPN services as well. From a host perspective, we have the ability to offer operating system hardening for both server and desktop, mobile device management with some of the leading vendors in this space as well, and also patching and monitoring services via SCCM and SCOM. From an application and data perspective, our professional services consulting team can assist with Active Directory, file share permission and security group structure to ensure that your data is secured, as well as look at implementing multi-factor authentication, which some of you may already use at the moment for accessing your online banking, for example, as well as other methods such as same sign-on and single sign-on capabilities, as well as application hardening according to vendor best practices. And from a user perspective, our managed services team pride themselves in our user onboarding and offboarding processes, as well as strict change control approval processes to ensure any changes to permissions and data access are logged and approved accordingly by the required personnel. And Brennan IT also plays an active role in the security landscape as well, providing alerts to clients based on emerging threats such as crypto locker. Security should be a driving force, not an afterthought. So our teams of architects and consultants can advise your business on how to increase the security of your data and networks across each of these layers discussed today. This ensures that your business's IT infrastructure, applications and data are as secure as possible in the constantly evolving threat landscape we find ourselves in. And now we'll go for some questions that may have come through on the webinar, and myself and Ben are still here to answer those if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, and I can see there's a question there just around materials around education for users around the email threats. You would have seen there the idea that we have the user awareness training. I think the other thing is in terms of the blogging that we do from a Mimecast point of view, the ebooks, etc. Those are resources that are sort of usually around what's emerging right now. They can be used as the basis either for your own internal education, or you can just refer users to have a look at it. But it can be a good sort of starting point or reference point in terms of getting something that's timely and I guess of interest to people as well. So I think the latest one we saw yesterday was all around the Mr. Robot Season 2 stuff, so they'll generally try and make it sort of fairly topical. Now I guess there's one there just around the Brennan sort of Mimecast interaction. The Brennan guys are able to absolutely sort of speak about what the various solutions look like, what the implementation looks like, how sort of best suit. And then Mimecast is very present from an Australian point of view as well. So in terms of being able to provide you with the pre-sales care, the aftercare, the local service support, customer experience, etc. It's a very close relationship, and also sort of a very comprehensive ownership of the customer that takes place within region, which is absolutely key. So the ability to issue test email, yeah, you can absolutely leverage the platform to do some sort of internal phishing, if you like, and the way that you would essentially do that is using that URL capture mechanism. You can blacklist any URL, whether it exists or not, essentially. So you can go through a mechanism saying, look, if we get an email, somebody clicks on this URL, capture it and show it in the statistics and the forensic logging. So that allows you to then be able to see who clicked when, who clicked first, how long did it take them to click. So we're definitely seeing that be used as well. So from the point of view of Office 365 outages, we've got a question there around that. When Mimecast acts as the gateway, so we've got this sort of obviously the inbound, the email, outbound as well, and we have our end user tools which you're able to roll out. With those elements in place, it means that we can effectively go around email infrastructure, which is key in terms of outage and whether that's unplanned or planned. But from an Office 365 and other cloud-based emails point of view, it can provide you with a really good insurance policy around the idea that if there's an outage, people will be able to continue to send and receive emails as normal. And the way that we do that is with our add-on for Outlook, which gives us that seamless cutover. It also will deliver internal emails, temporarily just do it via Mimecast essentially. And then when we have that, the sort of cut back or the fail back, we'll deliver down the emails and do a deduplication so that you end up with a true reflection of what should be there. Also, mobile apps and web-based email available throughout that outage as well. So again, it's a really good scenario in terms of, once you move to a cloud-based email, you're less hands-on in the resolution of an issue in a lot of cases, but this can allow you to assure the business that things are still up and running while that problem gets resolved in the background there. In terms of the implementation to transition to Mimecast, Mimecast has been around for now sort of over 12 years, 12, 13 years in this built-for-purpose space for multi-tenanted email support. So it's an absolutely tried and true procedure in terms of bringing customers on board, making sure that everything goes very naturally through that process. And yeah, so look, in terms of how we manage that, we'll provide by standard sort of a guided implementation where resources will be able to sort of generally do some of those actions on their own. Partners like Brennan can be involved, our professional services can be involved. It just depends on the scope and breadth, but absolutely all those different scenarios can be catered for. And for a basic implementation of a normal customer, it is generally just a case of those guidance emails being sent out and you doing the cutover steps as a customer. So it looks like that might be our questions. If there's, just got one question there around, do we filter regular junk email? Yeah, look, that's something we haven't focused on today, but it's something that absolutely there's a lot of depth to that email filtering that handles the traditional space, so antivirus, anti-spam. We have sort of SLAs which are based around 100% for virus, 99% around the spam, but essentially what you're consuming as a service is a clean feed of email. And as I say, the service desk and the service delivery guys are located within Australia. In the event that you are having any junk email flow through, it's treated as a support incident. We want to understand why, what we have to do to sort that out. So when you're on Mimecast, you shouldn't be, I guess, tolerating a level of regular spam. That should all be sort of resolved as part of that clean feed. Question there on the packaging. So from a Mimecast point of view, everything we looked at today in the security space is included in an S1 bundle, which is the security bundle. So you're not looking at a whole lot of different add-ons there. That said, like when we and Brennan understand your requirements, there'll be different bundles which are most relevant depending on your requirements. In terms of that broader scope, you would have seen there like continuity, archiving, etc. It tends to be a very simple price book with a small number of SKUs that we're talking about. So it'll just be understanding where your requirements are. But everything we looked at today is within that S1 product. Perfect. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for your attention. There's going to be the capability to obviously watch your recording if you want to sort of go back over any of this. And if there's any sort of background questions there to be taken offline, they'll be posted as well. Thanks very much for your time.
Yep, thanks everyone.